in Proverbs chapter 5, talking about following God's design. All right, so I've got something up here this morning. Does anybody know what this is?
It's a mole trap.
It's a mole trap or a gopher trap. And the gophers have a theme park in our neighborhood. It's called My Yard. And they've been making all kinds of new attractions, new rides in our yard. And so I got out my gopher traps yesterday and started putting them around. And a couple years ago, when one of our neighbors moved, he gave me his bucket of extra gopher traps and stuff like that. And so I used all the traps this time. And I was looking in the bottom and I saw this thing. Now, there's 4 of these. And I was like, what in the world kind of torture device is this? And I, obviously it's a gopher trap or a mole trap. I just couldn't figure out how to get it set. I mean, look at that. It looks like one of those things, those puzzles that you get, you have to try to figure out how to, get 2 solid rings together, or something like that. So me and Preston both got one, and we just started messing with it, and we finally figured out how to set it. You have to figure out all these little tricks, and then you get it going, and don't let go of it too fast. Anyway, and then it's set. But it's a pretty ingenious little device. And then whenever it goes off, bam, it catches a gopher. In fact, I caught 3 gophers last night. Not with this one. This one's clean. But with 2 that are just like this, and one of my old traps, I caught 3 gophers last night. Don't tell PETA, because they won't be happy with me. But this is a pretty interesting design, right? And luckily, I was able to figure out how it works. Me and the customer were able to figure out how it works. It would have been really nice if I had some directions, some ways to help me just know exactly how to do it. And so sometimes, in life, we need directions and to try to figure out how to, work according to the master's design. Well, the topic that we're going to talk about today, we might wish we had something more like a gopher trap, but it might look something more like this. Y'all ever played with one of these? I love these things. We've got a couple of these at our house, and I've never made it all the way through in one turn. This is a marble maze, and you have to turn it, just right, and make it spin and go in these little circles. You have to make it go down these tracks and drop up, holes. And if you've never done one of these and you just feel like frustrating yourself, it'll be up here on the front. But today we're talking about God's design for sex, and so sometimes God's design for sex feels more like this than it does like that simple, mole trap. You figure it out and you got to figure it out forever. With this, it seems like every time you pick up this ball, it's a little bit different, and it's a little bit new, and you've forgotten something about it. And in our culture, especially today, it seems like we have forgotten the way that sex is supposed to be utilized and the way that it was designed to be used. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And so this is one of those lessons that's always fun to teach. I should have pawned this off on somebody else. Maybe Dan cover it or Rusty. I was talking with Chance, and Chance is going to teach here at some point here in the next few weeks. And I was talking to him on Monday, and I was thinking, well, I should just let him teach this week. And that's before I knew what the topic was. So, man, I missed my chance. No pun intended. All right, so God's design, following God's design. We're in Proverbs chapter 5, verse 3 through 18, and we're going to. If you have a book, it actually skips verses 12, 13, and 14, but we're going to include those in there anyway as we read through today. So we're going to start out and just kind of talk about who wrote this. Okay, so in Proverbs 5 through 7, Solomon is warning his sons about the dangers and consequences of going outside of God's design for sex. Okay, Solomon is warning his sons. Where's the irony in that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody tell me, where's the irony in Solomon warning his sons about sex outside of marriage?
Well, yeah.
He did have 700 wives.
Yeah. How many did he have?
Solomon would know, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the guy had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And that's just a roundabout figure because he probably couldn't keep up. Probably couldn't keep up with them. But in 1 Kings 11:3, it says that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. In Ecclesiastes 2, 8 and 9, Solomon writes, it says, I amassed silver and gold for myself in the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers in a harem, as well the delights of a man's heart. So he says, I had money, and he talks about other things, property and all that kind of stuff, but money, gold, treasure of kings, provinces, servants, singers, and he had a harem. Yeah, a harem of 1,000 women. Now, you just imagine that. I mean, I don't understand why you would want to do that, but just imagine feeding them, clothing them, keeping them separate. Does that mean he had like a 1,000-room, hotel, that back there behind his palace? I don't know how that worked, but Solomon was obviously consumed. And we talked about, people say, well, they were all political wives. He was making treaties with these different people. Were there 1,000 countries that Solomon was interacting with? No, there was not 1,000 kings he was trying to appease and have good relations with. Solomon was a sex addict. If we get right onto it, that's who Solomon was. The man who desired wisdom above everything else. Whenever God said, hey, you can have anything that you want. He didn't ask for riches. He didn't ask for power. He didn't ask for sexual pleasure. He didn't ask for victory. He asked for wisdom. But what this shows us, as we've been talking about wisdom, as we've gone through Proverbs, is that having wisdom is one thing. Living wisely is another thing. Having discernment is one thing, but discerning how to move forward, how to progress forward, is something completely different. You can have wisdom, you can know the right things to do, but you must also choose to obey God and to follow His leading. But Solomon didn't, and it obviously cost him a lot. God promised him that at the end of his life, his kingdom would be divided, and his nation would go into turmoil, and that's exactly what happened. But Solomon realized, just a couple verses down after he talks about having that harem, he says, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired, I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had ever done, what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. So Solomon realized that no matter how much money you had, wealth you had, power you had, land you had, treasure you had, or how many women you had, you weren't satisfied. And so nothing satisfies you outside of God. And that's really what he wants his sons to get here in this passage. So let's dive in to what this has to tell us. We're going to be in Proverbs chapter 5 and start in verse 3. And so in verse 3 he says, though the lips of the forbidden woman drip honey and her words are smoother than oil, in the end she's as bitter as wormwood and as sharp as a double-edged sword. Her feet go down to death and her steps head straight for Sheol. She doesn't consider the path of life, and she doesn't know that her ways are unstable. And so he paints this picture of a woman who is desirable, right? And he calls her the forbidden woman, somebody who is outside of the confines that you are confined to. Now, he doesn't explain, he's writing to his sons. We don't know how old his sons are at this point. We don't know if they're married or if they're not married. But what he's referring to is a woman who does not belong to you. Okay? And obviously, we're going to talk about this from the standpoint of a male not pursuing women, but the reverse of this just as well. So this is somebody who doesn't belong. And in our culture, we would have to say, well, a man desiring a man, or a man desiring a woman who's not his wife, a woman desiring a man who's not her husband, or a woman desiring another woman, or any of those genders in between that people try to identify these days. Anything that is outside a man married to a woman, and that relationship we could consider here in this description of the forbidden woman. And it says that this forbidden woman, whoever this is outside his marriage relationship, says her words or her lips drip honey and her words are smoother than oil. So you think back to the context of when this was written. Okay, there wasn't much you could find that was sweeter than honey in that context. They didn't have refined sugar or high fructose corn syrup or Splenda or any of those kinds of things. So if he would have been in today, he might have said the forbidden woman's lips drip sweet and low. I don't know. There would be something maybe even sweeter than he could use for honey, but he was just trying to paint a picture of something that they craved, something that they desired, something that was treasured, that you could get to sweeten your food or just to make your food more desirable. And so this woman's lips dripped honey. She was just a temptation, the sweetest temptation, the most desiring temptation that you can imagine. And her words are smoother than oil. So you think about, they didn't have Bath and Body Works back then where you could go get all kinds of lotions, that smelled like roses and whatever else Bath and Body Works. Only thing Bath and Body Works smells like to me is a headache. And I'll walk in there and Millie will tell you, I'm just getting strong smells, and every once in a while she'll ask me, can you go to Bath and Body Works and get something for me? And I'm just like, this is a test of my love. You know, do I love my wife, or do I not want a headache? Which is it? And usually I go, maybe not always. Sometimes I'm like, tell you what, I'll drive you there. And I'll let you go in. But thankfully my wife is a frugal spender. For some of you that might be no dangerous. Just endure the headache. Don't send your wife to Bath and Body Works. So anyway, they didn't have lotions. They didn't have all this kind of spritzes and sprays and stuff to put on you. If they wanted their skin to be healthy and smooth, they used olive oil. Olive oil was the smoothest kind of, ointment that you could find. And so the picture that he's painting here is that her words are smooth. Her words, smooth over all the rough edges. They make you feel like everything is fine. That's what oils and lotions do, right? They kind of cover over the imperfections of your skin, or an oil in a car, helps to lubricate the car. It smooths over imperfections in the engine. And so there's a smoothness about oil that tends to cover over imperfections. And so whenever you see that desire, that sweet desire of her physical form, and then you hear that smooth tone of her voice that tends to smooth over and cover over the imperfections that you see in this situation, you're drawn into that situation. And so he says, though, in the end, she's as bitter as wormwood and as sharp as a double-edged sword. So wormwood was just a bush that was there that was real bitter to the taste, but sometimes they would have to use it for medicine and stuff like that. And it was as sharp as a double-edged sword. So it was going to, whenever you get into that relationship with her, it's going to cut you coming and going. It's never going to satisfy like you think it's going to satisfy. Whenever I thought about this being as bitter as wormwood and as sharp as a double-edged sword, it made me think about something that we talked about last night at the dinner table. And Melody you saw Melody just look up. She's like, what is he getting into? And so, the temptation of that forbidden woman is a promise of something good, right? It's a promise of some benefit, but on the flip side of it, it's going to hurt really bad, okay? So last night at dinner table, we got to talking about nasal spray. And, isn't that what you guys talk about at the dinner table? Are we the only ones? And we got talking about nasal spray, and then we're talking about hot sauce, and we're like, well, what if you mixed the two? So what if this was your nasal spray? It's got a similar shape. The bottle's a similar shape and everything. But the promise of nasal spray is what? Well, it's going to clear your nasal passages, maybe help you with allergies or something like that. There's going to be a benefit to it. But man, if you use that, it's going to clear your nasal passages. There's going to be that temporary benefit. But is there going to be some lingering, painful side effects? Yeah, you spray sriracha Tabasco sauce up your nasal passages, you're going to be feeling that for a while. You're going to be crying out of your ears, your eyes. Your ears are probably going to start bleeding. It's going to be bad, right? Well, that's kind of the same deal. There's that promised benefit in sex and pleasure outside the confines of marriage. There's that temptation that's there, and we have to be honest. There is pleasure that's there, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be a temptation. It's kind of like whenever you go to the buffet and you go for that first meal, that first plate, and then you go back for the second plate and that third plate. You don't need those other plates, but there's a pleasurable benefit to going back. Well, there's a pleasurable benefit to sexual relationships outside of marriage. Otherwise, we wouldn't be tempted to go into them. But in the end, they're going to leave you hurting. Just like that nasal spray would leave you hurting if you went for that. And so James talks about this temptation, this process of temptation. He says, but each person is tempted when he's drawn away and enticed by his own evil desire. And then look at how he describes this. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is fully grown, it gives birth to death. And so there's this pathway that he talks about where the sin starts out small. There's a temptation that's small. It gives birth to sin. So you got this little infant sin, but that infant sin is going to grow. It's going to get larger. It's going to get larger, and eventually that sin is going to drag you down to death. And so sin is something that tempts us and that pulls us away from God's perfect will. And so as he talks about this, he gets to that point as well. He says that her feet go down to death. Her steps head straight for Sheol. And so Sheol was the place of the dead in the Old Testament. That was how they described the place of the dead. And so this relationship with this woman outside of the confines of marriage, it's going to draw you away. It's going to ultimately destroy you. And we'll talk about that some more in a moment. But one thing we have to also realize is that this doesn't just apply, this reality doesn't just apply to somebody who's already in a marriage relationship. It applies to the woman who is enticing somebody as well. And it applies to that temptress. So you flip that around, and it applies to any kind of man who tries to, tempt a woman into a sexual relationship, or use manipulation to get a woman to sleep with him, or something like that. The person on the other side also is going to reap the consequences of this pathway, and that's what he says here. He says she doesn't consider the path of life, and she doesn't know that her ways are unstable. So this is going to cost her as well. This isn't just a one-way street where if you step outside the bounds of marriage, you're going to get consequences. If you're not married, or if you're the one who's tempting somebody into that relationship, there's consequences that come for that person as well. And so we need to realize that. As we move forward to the next verses 7 through 8, we look at the long-term effects of this situation. So thinking long-term, a lot of times the reason that sexual temptation is so tempting is because it's in the moment, right? It's that pleasure in the moment that we're seeking after, whether it's actual physical sexual encounter, or whether it's that emotional relationship that sometimes we get drawn into. There's such things that as an emotional affair these days we talk about, where you get emotionally or you're just emotionally connected to somebody that really in a way that's not healthy, that you should be connecting with your own spouse. But then we also have to think about pornography. Pornography is outside the perfect will of God for sexual relationships. You are viewing that content that is outside of God's plan for marriage. And so pornography and everything that stems from that, and all these relationships, these have long-term effects. Solomon says, "So now, sons, listen to me, and don't turn away from the words from my mouth. Keep your way far from her. Don't go near the door of her house." And so he says, and we've talked about this before, so we didn't spend a whole lot of time on it, but he says, listen to me and don't turn away from the words of my mouth. And we talked about that a few lessons back, how whenever God's wisdom is given to us, we need to listen to it. We don't need to avoid it. We don't need to ignore it. We don't need to just walk by and say, oh, that's cute. We need to listen to God's words and cling to those words. And then he says, keep far from her. Don't go near the door of her house. Okay. Don't go near the door of her house. And so, and he's painting this picture of a sexual relationship that would happen inside the walls of this woman's house. So he's saying, hey, look, the way to avoid that is not to even get close to the door, right? Now, that doesn't mean go peek in the window. That doesn't mean, come into the front gate, hang out in the front yard. That's not what that means. He's saying stay far away from this kind of temptation. All right? Stay far away from this kind of temptation. And I brought up pornography because pornography really, when it comes to sexual sin, pornography is kind of the gateway drug of sexual sin. Research shows that pornography often acts as a gateway to adultery, as well as more illicit actions such as getting into child pornography or violent sexual acts and molestation. I looked up on Covenant Eyes website, which Covenant Eyes is a accountability software that you can put on your phone, you can put on your computer to help if you struggle with pornography. But on their website, it says that almost every person that they ever have to deal with in the areas of sexual crimes, almost every one of them trace back their beginnings to pornography. You don't just wake up one morning and say, hey, I think I'll go be a child molester. You don't wake up one morning and just say, hey, I think I'll go commit adultery today. There's usually an entrance point. And that entrance point for most people is usually pornography. And when we say that, we're usually talking about men, but these days women are becoming more and more and more addicted to pornography as well. And so this is really becoming a gateway drug for all kinds of people. And so we have to be careful of that. Now, he says, stay far away from her house, don't go near the door of her house. This makes me think of a quote that an old friend of mine said back whenever we were in Terrell, and it's always stuck with me because it was just simple. And it's my good buddy Mark Nichols. I'll have to send him this picture here later today. But he would say this. He said, what's the best way to not run 10 miles? And then he would say something like, you can look at me and I would tell that I don't like to run 10 miles, right? And so he would say, what's the best way to not run 10 miles? And he said, don't run 1 mile. I don't know why I put an exclamation point there. That's supposed to be a 1. Okay? Don't run 1 mile. The best way to not run 10 miles? Well, don't run 1. And you'll guarantee to not run 10, right? Well, it's kind of the same thing with sexual sin. How do you not engage in sexual sin? Well, don't take that first step. Don't go near the door. Because if you're not near her door, can you go in her house? No. If you're not hanging out in the front yard, well, then you can't get into the house. And so that's the best way to avoid that sexual sin, is to not even take those first steps. But sometimes we're tempted by that pleasure. We're tempted by that that honey on our lips and that smooth words, and we think, well, I'll just listen, or I'll just take a peek, I'll just take a peek, or I won't touch. I'll just look. We take these different pathways, and those steps really are running 1 mile, and then running 2 miles, and then running 3 miles, and before you know it, oh man, I just ran 10 miles. And so that's kind of the way that these sexual sins entice you and tempt you and get you down the road. And so we need to be like Jesus. Jesus in the model prayer, he said this. He prayed, and do not bring us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Now Jesus prayed, do not bring us into temptation. God, the scripture says God does not tempt you. That God will not tempt you to do something wrong. It says that he will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you can bear. So there's a difference there, right? It says that God won't tempt you. Okay? God's not going to throw a nugget out there, or a hook out there trying to catch you, but he does allow temptation to come our way. But what does he say about that temptation? God will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you can bear, but in that moment, he will provide for you a way out. All right? Now that temptation may be, hey, come on inside. Hey, click here. But the way out is that God has provided you with every resource. He's provided you with the Holy Spirit. He's provided you with that Spirit of God to help you overcome those temptations. And so sometimes we have to take some preemptive measures, which might be a site blocker on your computer or your iPhone or something like that. Or it could be accountability in your relationships with other people. It could be setting up systems to make sure that you don't even put yourself in a compromising kind of situation. And one of the things that we do here at Green Acres South, that we've done ever since I came here, is we make a point to make sure that Randy, our administrative assistant, is never up here alone with me or Boogie or any other of our staff members. So either Boogie and I are both here, and for a while, in the first couple years, if he had to leave, I would leave, or if I had to leave, he would leave. Or if he called me up and he said, hey, I'm sick. If I called him and said, hey, I'm sick, well, the other person just wouldn't come in. Now we have volunteers who come up during the week, and they do things during the day, like setting up chairs for rooms or doing some cleaning and stuff like that. And that allows Boogie and I to kind of come and go. But we make certain, not because there's a temptation to do something wrong there, but because we don't want to put Randy or ourselves in any kind of situation that could be perceived as compromised or inappropriate. And so sometimes you have to kind of seem to go way extreme to put yourself in a situation where you're above reproach. And we need to be willing to do those things and think long term about the consequences of not doing that. In Proverbs 5:9-14, as he continues, he says, don't go near her house, otherwise you will give up your vitality to others and your years to someone cruel. Strangers will drain your resources, and your hard-earned pay will end up in a foreigner's house. At the end of your life, you will lament when your physical body has been consumed, and you will say, how I hated discipline, and how my heart despised correction. I am on the verge of complete ruin before the entire community. All right? So just think about that. Let's talk about some of these things. He says, you will give up your vitality, you'll give up your years, you will lose your resources and your hard-earned pay. At the end of your life, you will lament, and your physical body has been consumed, and you'll say, I've hated discipline, my heart despised correction, and I'm on the verge of complete ruin before the entire community. He lists these different consequences of stepping outside God's pattern for sex. And so let's think about that in our context. What are the costs of sexual sin? Let's just go ahead, let's be bold, let's list these things. What are the costs of sexual sin?
Divorce.
Okay, divorce,
Disease.
disease,
Reputation.
okay, what else?
Kids?
Children? Not that children are, and chances of not saying that children are undesirable or anything like that, but they are best raised in with a husband and wife situation. Okay? What else?
Your walk with the Lord.
Okay? This thing. There we go. Alright,
Trust.
okay, trust. Right, because even if divorce doesn't happen, that trust is broken, right? Right? Is there any kind of situation where a sexual sin could make you lose your job?
Sure.
Right? I mean, if you go down that path to where you become a child molester, that's
Prison.
gonna, yeah, make you lose your job. It could send you to prison. Alright. And whenever you think about children, if you wind up having a divorce, you're gonna have child support and alimony, potentially.
It could lead to death if you have a jealous other person.
Yeah, it could. That's not uncommon, is it?
No.
Alright.
About abortion.
What's that?
Abortion.
Abortion, that's right, yeah. So it could lead to abortion, which we would categorize as murder, so it could even lead you to that.
So it basically leads to other sin.
Yeah.
Compounds
leads to
itself,
other
snowballs.
things. You know, these mainly deal with physical sexual sin, but even pornography can lead to things like identity theft. Those links that they send your way that put stuff on your computer and all that kind of stuff. And so even some of those things we think we can get away with can still cost us in the end. And so there's a lot of costs to sexual sin, aren't there? Now, whenever you are hearing those smooth words and seeing that attractive person and you're being tempted into that situation, is this what comes to your mind? No. You don't sit there and start calculating the cost. Well, okay, this could cost me this, and you hold that up and you don't sit there and you compare the two. You have to think about this beforehand, right? You have to plan in advance to not be lured into that temptation. And so these are real costs. These aren't just artificial things. These are actual real costs. I mean, some of these you could actually put a monetary value to, right? A lot of them you could also put a physical value to. Whenever he talks about your body wasting away at the end of life, when he says at the end of your life, verse 11, you will lament when your physical body has been consumed. I have a feeling that Solomon knew what he was talking about. If he had 1,000 women that were his wives, he probably was not physically doing well. He had probably gotten some STDs at some point. And so, STDs aren't an invention of our modern world. These are things that have been around for years. And so, Solomon probably knew exactly what he was talking about. So there is a definite cost to this sexual sin. So we need to think about that long-term, those long-term consequences. Okay, but let's talk about the flip side. Okay, because we're talking about God's design, right? Following God's design. So we've kind of talked about and focused on the negative right now. So far, let's talk about the positive. Okay, we want to enjoy God's provision. In verse 15 through 18, he says, "Drink water from your own cistern, water flowing from your own well. Should your springs flow in the streets, streams in the public squares, they should be for you alone and not for you to share with strangers. Let your fountain be blessed and take pleasure in the wife of your youth." Okay, so he says, drink water from your own cisterns. Now, if you lived in a country that looked like that, what would you think about water?
Valuable.
Very valuable, right? I mean, there are parts of Israel that are very lush, especially around the river, around the Jordan and the Sea of Galilee, some very lush areas. But a lot of Israel is very arid. The area around Jerusalem is very dry, very arid location. And so in that culture, I mean, we think of water and we think oh, okay, water, well, it sustains you. You know, for us, water is something that sustains us, that we have to drink, you know, because the government, health experts tell us to drink it, right? Otherwise, we would drink Dr. Pepper, we would drink sweet tea all the time, and that's what we would, you know, we'd be down at Mountain Dew and Red Bulls. I mean, that's what we would live on. But the experts say, well, you have to drink water. I've always wondered, you know, why tea doesn't count, and I guess it's because of the caffeine, you know, or something like that. But, you know, you have to stay hydrated. Well, so we see water as a have to, right? Well, they see water as a luxury. If they're having plenty of water, well, that was a luxury. And there was times where, you know, if the rainy seasons hadn't come, water was not be in short supply. And so he says that you need to drink water from your own cistern, water flowing from your own well. Should your spring flow in the streets and in the public squares? They should be for you alone and not for you to share with strangers. And so he really focuses in on your own stuff, right? Your own cistern, your own well, your springs in the streets. They are for you alone. All right? And so for Solomon, he was writing, he was saying, look, water is precious. Water is something to be treasured. Water is something to be appreciated, to be thankful for. And if you have a water source, because he says your own cistern, your own well, your own spring. I mean, for somebody to have those things, even to have one of those things, for somebody to have their own well in a city like Jerusalem or, you know, any of those, you know, regional cities, that would be a huge, huge luxury. I mean, you'd have to be a wealthy person to have your own well or your own cistern. If you think about the story of the woman at the well, when Jesus goes through Samaria, he has an encounter with the woman at the well. He sits by the well, waiting for her to come. And why did she come all the way outside the city to go to a well? Well, because there wasn't one in her backyard. She had to go all the way outside the city, take those water jars, go all the way out there, fill it up, carry it all the way back. She had to do that a couple times a day just to have water. So for somebody to have their own cistern, their own well, their own spring, that is a huge luxury. So Solomon is saying, look, if you've got your own spouse, you're so blessed. Okay? If you've got your spouse, you are so blessed. You have such a gift. You have such a luxury. Why do you need to go anywhere else when you've got your own? And if that's your own, that's your own. Don't give away your resources. Don't spill your resources out in the street. Use your resources. You know, cherish that well. He's saying, look, if you had your own spring, would you divert the water and let it just go out into the street? No, you would be letting it fill up your wells and fill up your cisterns, and you'd be protecting your source of water there. And so he's saying, look, this is your place of benefit. This is your own personal source of pleasure. And that's the way God has designed sex, is to be, yes, it does have, you know, procreation, leads to children, all that kind of stuff, but it's designed to be a pleasurable thing that brings a husband and wife together. You know, we could get into talking about all the chemicals and stuff that are released in the brains that seal you together and all that kind of stuff, and those are true. But God designed that sexual relationship to cement your love for one another, to cement that relationship with one another. And so he says, do not share it with strangers. You know, don't share it with strangers. Jesus said it. In Exodus, it says it, you know, very clear in the Ten Commandments. Do not commit adultery. You know, that was a given from the get-go. Do not commit adultery. That was one of those first 10 sets of rules that God gave the Israelites. Do not commit adultery. There's no ifs after that. There's no except fors after that. It just says, do not commit adultery. And we think, okay, well, you know, talking about the physical stuff. Well, Jesus said this. He said, you've heard that it was said, do not commit adultery, but I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so what Jesus does is he takes this physical commandment and he turns it into a mental or emotional commandment, right? Because the kind of goes back to Mark's statement. You know, if you don't want to run 10 miles, don't run 1 mile. Well, if you start thinking about those sexual sins, the sexual temptations, they're taking root in your mind and root in your heart. That's going to lead to the eventual physical event. And so Jesus is saying, look, the way to overcome physical adultery is to first overcome mental adultery, first overcome emotional adultery. That's why pornography is such a huge issue. It's such a a gateway to other things, because you get that mental addiction going, and then that mental addiction isn't good enough anymore. It's just like people who begin on a small drug, and then that doesn't give them enough high, so they go something worse and something worse. Or they drink a little bit, but that doesn't give them enough buzz anymore, so they have to drink more, and they have to drink more, and they have to drink more. And so it's the same way. You get addicted to that little bit of sexual pleasure visually, but then you have to have, harder and harder kinds of pornography, and then that's not good enough anymore, so you have to go to the physical. And then that physical is not good enough anymore, so you have to go to something that's even more extreme. And so Jesus is saying, look, the way to conquer that temptation is not to just say, I'm not gonna, have physical connection with somebody, but first to conquer the mental, to conquer the emotional, to get to that place where you don't struggle with that, or you've had victory over that temptation that exists in your mind and your heart. And so he says, don't share that with strangers. And then he finishes up, let your fountain be blessed, and take pleasure in the wife of your youth. So this is his last little commandment for us. Let your fountain be blessed, and take pleasure in the wife of your youth. And so obviously, God's ideal for marriage is that you have married one person, you stay married to that person for life. And I realize that that's not the situation that everybody finds themselves in. But if you're married now, take pleasure in that relationship. It doesn't matter if it's your first marriage or if you got to the point where it's your second, third, fourth, fifth, or however far, whoever you're married to right now, take pleasure in that relationship and honor God in that relationship and be committed in that relationship. If you're not married, be committed to finding your spouse, being faithful to that spouse now, physically and mentally. And when you get married, stay committed to that spouse for the rest of your life. I used to tell the teenagers, the way to guarantee that you have the best sex of your life is to only have sex with one person, because then there will be no comparison, there will be no questioning, there'll be no this person was this person was that. If you just have that sexual relationship with one person for your whole life, then that person will be the person that you've had the best sex with. Because people always say, well, how do you know that that's the logic of our world. How do you know you're going to be physically compatible and sexually compatible and stuff like that? Well, if you only have sex with one person, then you're going to be compatible with that one person, and you're not going to have anybody else to compare your compatibility to. And so that's God's design, to take pleasure in that spouse, to take pleasure in that person that God connected you to. Okay? And so that's our lesson for the day. It's always one that's such a joy to talk about. But, it's in the scripture, right? And the reason that things like this are in there and that Song of Solomon is there is because God does have a design for this amazing gift that He has given us. And just like many gifts, if we don't use it correctly, it can become a danger to us, right? And so it's important for us to study these things and consider what God has to say for us.